Damas y caballeros, welcome back to From Across the Pond. I'm here today to record the Nashville SC episode for the 2022 MLS season. And I've got my man Drake Hills with me, so thank you very much for coming on, man. How are you?
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. I'm doing pretty good. It's the start of another season. It felt like just like last week that 2021 ended, especially with Nashville way up in Philadelphia, bowing out to the Union. But we're in year 3 of this franchise. It's a bit of a different taste in the beginning of the season. So I'm curious to see how 2022 works out.
Yeah, it's been a short off season, obviously, with the tightened schedule because of the World Cup at the end of this year. But just reflecting on the first 2 years initially, so obviously Nashville came in alongside Inter Miami, who were seen to be the more glamorous franchise, obviously based on location and the names behind. And they were kind of, understated Nashville. Everyone thought, talking about Miami instead of Nashville. We've then seen 2 straight playoff seasons at the elite of the Eastern Conference. So do you think now, especially after last year, that Nashville are talked about and respected in the way they should be, given the first 2 years of the franchise?
Yeah, Nashville's in an interesting position, right? Because if you take a look at that first year, as you mentioned, with David Beckham and Jorge Mas and the ownership of Inter Miami, they're pulling in Rodolfo Pizarro from Monterrey in Mexico, obviously Luis Morgan out of Celtic, Julian Carranza, Matias Pellegrini, 2 young South Americans that were looking to use MLS to get them to Spain or to France or to England. And so they definitely had the pieces to compete. Unfortunately, Diego Alonso was not the coach to put those pieces together. Meanwhile, with Nashville, Gary Smith, obviously someone, if you support Wickham Wanderers, if you know about his father, Roger Smith, Tottenham and Arsenal guy coming up in the 60s, he's well known in the coaching circles, Gary is. And so, he's already won MLS Cup before with Colorado Rapids. And so he came with this MLS pedigree and just hit the ground running, not only just with how he defensively lined up his team, but also the players that they chose, right? They signed Walker Zimmerman, a national team guy for the U.S. Obviously, you brought in Randall Leal, a Costa Rica international, and Anibal Godoy, a Panama international. But you also brought in MLS veterans like Dave Romney. You brought in other guys like Dax McCarty, who's really like one of the most seasoned MLS players, really in history. And so you take a look at how they lined up their team, and they were understanding of what MLS was. And to directly answer your question about the respect, I think it's interesting because they definitely earned that respect in the Eastern Conference, playing against Philadelphia, DC, New York Red Bulls, New York City FC, Inter Miami, Atlanta United, FC Cincinnati. But now it's interesting because in their 3rd year, Nashville SC has to go to the West, and they got to go up against the Galaxy, LAFC. They got to go up against Sporting KC. They got to go up against Minnesota United. Obviously, Seattle Sounders being one of the biggest clubs in the league. So it's going to be something that Gary Smith actually predicted, which is we almost have to reprove ourselves again in 2022, which will be interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that leads on to my next question perfectly. So obviously, how do you think the franchise, Gary Smith and the front office, Mike Jacobs, are viewing this transition to the Western Conference? Because like you say, they've proven themselves in the Eastern Conference. They were kind of on the cusp of maybe if they'd stayed this year, kind of challenging for the Eastern Conference finals and that. So how are they going to take this new step with obviously the loads of travel and all that's going to come into place for them?
Yeah, Nashville doesn't like it. That's for sure. I was told on background, some sources were telling me that they were quite ticked off because they felt that Nashville felt that Chicago is a team that actually would have fit better. They're technically more westward than Nashville is if you look at the longitude of the U.S. And also Nashville in its first 2 years in MLS already built more rivalries than Chicago has as a team that's been in the league since '98, right? So Nashville has rivalries against, notably and most recently against New York City, against Orlando, historically against Cincinnati, and also against Atlanta. Those are 4 rivalries within 2 seasons. Chicago, you can't name a rivalry. They don't have a derby whatsoever. And so it was like this question, this flabbergasting moment of, why can't we send Chicago to the West and make them play and build a rivalry with Minnesota and build a rivalry with St. Louis, who will eventually be coming into the league next year in 2023. So there's that, but also, you know, they know that they need a bigger squad. They need some depth, especially in places like center back where, you know, the two center halves I mentioned, Walker Zimmerman, Dave Romney, who is obviously one of the best passing left-footed center backs in the league. Dave played all but one game in the regular season last year. Can you imagine that? 34 regular season games. He played a full 90 in 33 and didn't play in the final because he had a stiff calf. So they had to go and they went into the college draft and they got a center back. And then, of course, they need to build up their center mids. So in the middle of the park, they've added a top free agent. And then, of course, up front, I think their business is not done in the transfer window, not necessarily in January. But once you get into the summer, I think they're going to add another striker because they know once they get in the second half of the season that you mentioned the travel is going to be ridiculous. You're talking about, you know, I don't know the kilometers, but in miles, it's like over 6,000 miles round trip, you know? When you start talking about going to Vancouver and then flying to Seattle and then going to San Jose and then coming back to Nashville. Obviously, in the round trip, the miles that are included with that. So for Nashville, it's going to be tough. And I don't think that they're going to have those streaks that they had the past 2 years where they were unbeaten in 7, 8, 9, 10 matches. I think they're going to have to learn how to take some losses up front. But I think they're also going to be winning a lot more games as well.
Yeah, maybe use some of those draws that they got last year as well.
Exactly. They were. I believe they tied the league most for. I believe it was 14 or 16 draws out of 34. That's
crazy.
You know, you're drawing almost half your matches. That's crazy.
It's a good sign, though. It's a good sign. But talking about the roster outlook at the moment, obviously one of the big moves, kind of outgoings from Nashville this offseason was Alistair Johnston going to Montreal. So there's kind of a hole in the right back position. Yeah. What do you see the club doing? Do you see them strengthening in January or looking towards the summer for that as well? Or do they have an internal replacement ready?
Yeah, there's definitely some reports surrounding Nashville in terms of Tenerife in Spain, Shaq Moore, U.S. international, who can either play left back, right back. He can play as a wing back. That would be a big time signing for them. They would have to use a lot of general allocation money, a lot of targeted allocation money as well. I'm hearing a couple of million for the transfer fee from Tenerife. So it would help them to put, especially international, given that Alistair Johnston pretty much played every game for Canada last year in 2021, including their World Cup qualifiers. So it's a big move, but they got a lot in return for him. So that gives them the versatility, Nashville, to pretty much go and buy out, you know, whichever top tier fullback that they can get. But they definitely need to go out and sign somebody. However, I will say that the change in shape from Nashville, Gary Smith came in with that 4-2-3-1 conventional shape, but he's really preferred that 3-4-3, 3-5-2 hybrid. And what that does is allow them to play their young center back, their promising center back in Jack Mayer. He's about, 6'3". He's put on some extra weight. He's about 185, 190 pounds now. And he's become, a top tier draft pick and transferred and developed into a starting level center back. And so you can put him alongside Dave Romney and Walker Zimmerman. You can go ahead and put Alex Mawil at wing back. You can go ahead and put Hanwala Buwana. You could even put another winger out there that is able to play wing back. So it gives Nashville some versatility to change up that shape, but I definitely think that they need to go up and build some more squad depth in that spot.
Yeah, for sure. And then moving on to another off-season move that they made. So a big splash in the off-season is we've seen the emergence of free agency in the MLS. So with Nashville and obviously with Seattle with Albert Rusnak. So bringing in Sean Davis do you think like one of the leading players from another MLS franchise and bringing him over to Nashville, do you kind of, for Nashville, how do you see this? And do you think that free agency is going to become more of a big player in roster construction like it is in the NBA and NFL in the future of MLS?
Yeah, I'll start with the latter part of that question. I think free agency should grow. I'm all for free agency. The unfortunate part about it is in MLS there is the eligibility factor of it, right? You have to be 28 in a minimum, I think, of 5 years of MLS experience. And that's tough, right? Because if you're starting as an 18-year-old, 19-year-old, and maybe your contract goes 3 years and you're 22 and you only have 3 years of experience, it's tough, right? It puts you in a tough situation you're not necessarily able to move on per se from that club unless somebody comes and trades for you. So I think it's better for MLS to see these players go to the teams that they want to go to. But on the former part of your question, think about Sean Davis as a former captain 2 years with New York Red Bulls. He led the league in total distance covered, total distance per 90 minutes. He had one of his best passing percentages in his whole career of about 7 seasons, as he's entering his 8th year with Nashville. So that brings leadership, and also I think that brings top-tier midfield play and gives you a guy that is a tenacious ball winner in the middle of the park. And I think on top of that, Sean is a team guy. He's a good locker room guy. And so when you think about how Nashville is, it's a healthy locker room. And so it's almost like an exclamation point for Nashville to help emphasize them and their quality going into 2022.
Yeah, for sure. And him alongside, obviously, Dax McCarty and Godoy, who are obviously aging, but still at the kind of elite level of the MLS, that's obviously going to help the strength and depth that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, with Anibal and Dax, they're guys who, at the end of last year, if you combine their age, they're 33 and a half, right? I mean, that's a lot, especially with Dax, given that, he's been in the league since 2006. I don't know about you, but if you look at the Premier League or MLS, regardless, there's not many players coming from a 2006 era that's still playing top-tier flight football. So for someone like that who's played a ton of minutes, who's played for the U.S. men's national team, who's been someone who's gone from being a number 8 or even a number 10 at times, he's gone back into being a legit 6. And with Anibal being a nasty, just again, tenacious ball winner, destroyer in center midfield, I think putting Sean Davis in that group gives them some opportunity to maybe balance those minutes and focus on some load management, especially when you start talking about doing those 3 and 4 game road trips. So I'm actually curious to see how many starts Sean gets, especially once we get into March and April.
Yeah, for sure. And then moving further up the field, so obviously in the middle of the season last year, Ake Lobo was brought in from Monterrey. Obviously big price tag, looking to be the number 9 up front to kind of complement with Leal and with Hani Mukhtar. So he didn't settle straight away. Do you think how successful Nashville are this season depends on him settling quickly, or do you think like the MLS experience of CJ Sapong and Teo Bunbury can kind of fill in for him if he doesn't hit the heights that Nashville want him to?
I would say the latter part that you make, I think that could be a good introduction for Nashville. If you start talking about, you got to go to Seattle Sounders, that's never easy. And mind you, there's a soccer stadium that they're opening on May 1st, and they got to play, I think it's 6 straight on the road before that. I think it's tough to include Ake and have him start and produce early when you're on the road for so many games to start the season. So I think with Teal and with CJ to start the season as your front 2, I think that will allow Ake to get acclimated. He's now going through his first preseason with Nashville. As you can remember, and as you stated, he came through in the middle of the season last year. So I think it'll be interesting for him to use Teal and CJ as kind of like a ramp to rev up. And hopefully once come April and May, we'll start seeing Ake start. Hopefully he can get in the first 90. He hasn't played over 45 minutes yet. But with a preseason, I think that'll be more possible this year. So we'll see.
Yeah, and obviously with moving to the Western Conference, they've kind of focused again. I think this is the strength of Nashville, like we were talking about earlier with Inter Miami, kind of looking outside to glamorous players, Higuain, Pizarro coming in, you know, the Argentinians that came in. Nashville kind of looked for a base of MLS experience, right. And they've kind of done that again with this offseason because of moving to the Western Conference, a bit of upheaval. Do you think that's going to benefit them as well with the long travel and, you know, the 6 games in a row off the bounce away?
Absolutely, especially if you have guys like Alex Mouil, who, you know, he comes from the New York Red Bulls Academy. And for those who are unaware or maybe not quite informed about Red Bulls, your work rate will be top tier. You cannot graduate from the Red Bulls Academy and make it to the first team without one of the best work rates in the league. That's just how they play. They press higher than anybody. They work more than anybody. That's why their team is so young all the time, because they need fresh legs. So you have Alex Mouil coming off the bench. You have a guy like Hanwala Bwana is someone who hasn't been used much, but he will. Jack Mayer is another one. You're going to have just guys who kind of know what it's about. They know what it's like to put in the shifts. So I definitely think that when you start talking about these long road trips, they will come in handy for sure.
And in 2021, we saw a massive spike in Hani Mukhtar's production, kind of that second season settling in. If you were to predict, do you foresee anyone kind of making that jump that's in the team now in the second season, or, you know, a big breakout player for this coming season?
Yeah, I think I'm not quite sure if anyone will have a Hani Mukhtar 2021 level season. Someone who finished, I believe that was second in the voting for MVP. League MVP, I think second or third. I think it's hard to see because, you know, aside from Hani, maybe Randall Leal, someone who maybe didn't get the root of the benefit that Mukhtar and CJ Sapong did, goals and assist wise. But aside from them, I just see everyone else just remaining steady, just going, doing their thing. I would say let's see what Ake Loba does. But as far as Hani Mukhtar, I do want to say that, you know, if he does duplicate what he did in the first half of last year, especially when you look at what he did in June and July, I would be wondering to see if anyone at the end of the summer transfer window, if someone from a Portugal or a Spain or even a France, but I see more of a Portugal and a Spain if they're looking to sign Hani. I'm not saying that he will go to a top tier club, but I would say look at somebody, not literally these clubs, but just think about the tier of where these clubs are at. Think about someone who he's familiar with in a Benfica. Think about a Valencia. Think about a Sevilla, or if you look at even a Porto, right? I mean, those types of clubs that, you know, they're not the Barcelonas, they're not the Madrids, they're not the Bayern Munichs, they're not even honestly, they're not even like an Atletico Madrid. But think about that tier just below that, and if Hani does what he did last year at the beginning of the season or in the middle of the season, I could see someone like that having interest in paying 9 to 12 million for Hani. So we'll see.
Do you think that's in the thinking of Hani and the front office as well, kind of that window into the possibility of that transpiring?
Well, as far as Hani, well, actually both of them, I think, are in absolute no rush to leave Nashville. Hani has mentioned with us at the Tennessean in our publication that, you know, he's looking to buy a house here in Nashville. So he's quite comfortable here, not only on the pitch but off the pitch. He has his role as the guy on this team. He is the poster boy for this team, and off the field, I mean, he's come quite accustomed to life in Nashville, and so it would take a lot for him to consider uprooting his life once again. In March, he will be 27. So this is the point in his life where he's looking for some consistency. He's looking to win trophies. That's his big thing, just like any other player who's at the top of their career. As for Nashville, you know, they paid, I think it was just under $4 million for him. So with his value pretty much tripling, I think the base is 9.5 to 10 million. So if you're a top club in Europe, you have to come correct. You probably have to come in at 10 million plus to even get Nashville to think about letting him go in the middle of the season.
Yeah. And like you say, being successful this year, obviously it's the return of the Open Cup this year. And we've also got an expanded Leagues Cup with the Liga MX sides.
Right.
So do you think that's something Nashville will be looking for, maybe kind of trying to bed into the first year in the Western Conference, get into the playoffs, but maybe focusing their attention on a cup to try and be successful?
I think so. I think that's a good way to bring Nashville to the next level, right? Winning trophies is always going to make your club bigger. That's how you grow clubs. That you win games, but you got to win trophies. And so with Nashville, I think the Open Cup entering in the third round, they will start either May 10th or May 11th and enter the third round. I think that'll be a good opportunity for them. The Leagues Cup, it will be a little more different because, as you mentioned, you got to go up against the top clubs in Liga MX. But I think with the Open Cup, that's a good way, something that the fans are familiar with when they were in second-tier USL. If Nashville can win an Open Cup in 2022, and particularly in their own ground that they just opened, that would be tremendous.
So, and then looking towards the league side of things, I foresee Nashville, even though with the transition to the Western Conference, being a playoff side. But do you think, obviously we're talking about the travel and the issues that might present, do you think that they'll have the ability to maybe get a top 4 team that will enable them not to have to travel, at least in the first round of the playoffs?
Yeah, I think the top 4 is going to be tough, right? Because you got to think about Sporting Kansas City, Seattle. I think Colorado is going to be back, even though they traded away Kellen Acosta to LA. I think Colorado is going to be back. And quite honestly, I'm not ready to bow out against Minnesota. And I'm not ready to doubt the LA teams either. I think the Galaxy, it was rough. They had a lot of injuries. I think it was unfair for them to miss the playoffs last year. I think RSL got a little lucky on that goal that pretty much put them over the line. But I definitely see Nashville in the top 6. I think if they don't get a top 4, they'll be 5th or 6th seed. If they do, it'll be helpful, right? Because then they don't have to worry about Seattle or Sporting Kansas City, particularly in the conference semifinal. I think if they place 4th, I could see Nashville getting to a conference final, especially with the veterans that they have. If Hani's playing top tier like he did last year, if Randall can maybe reach 8 goals, 8 assists, 8 goals, 5 assists even. And if he even gets to double digits, I think it's a definite that Nashville can place into the top 4. It just depends on how their best players are at, where they're at, and obviously health as well.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Drake. I really appreciate it. And hopefully speak to you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.